They said she was crazy. They said she was done. When Celeste Morrow walked out of a Chicago penthouse without a single cent to her name, the whole world called her a loser. Her husband, Preston Hale, a fintech mogul on the verge of a $15 billion IPO, laughed in front of his lawyers, then erased her name from the company's history. He thought he had won. He thought she would waste away in a cheap rental on the outskirts of Detroit. But he forgot one thing. The woman he threw out on the street was the same woman who had written every line of code that built his empire. And 4 months later, when she came back, she didn't come alone. Standing behind her was Barrett Kane, a name that the underground financial world on the East Coast only dared to whisper. This was a man who never helped anyone. But this time, he broke his own rule. This is the story of a woman who lost everything, and how she took it all back. Not with money, not with violence, but with the very mind they thought they had stolen. If this story made you believe that no one can truly steal a person's worth, hit like and share it so this message reaches further. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story where justice may arrive late, but it never fails to show up. The penthouse on the 58th floor looked down over the Chicago skyline like a glass box suspended in the sky. Inside, the air was so cold and so still that Celeste could hear Preston's fingers sliding across the screen of his phone. He sat on the sofa with one leg crossed over the other, his eyes fixed on Asian stock charts, not even bothering to look up when she stepped into the room. On the glass table between them lay a thick stack of papers, bound in a blue cover, with the words, "Conditional Divorce Agreement," printed in the upper right corner. Preston let her stand there for nearly 1 minute before he spoke, his voice calm, as if he were reading a quarterly report. "Sit down, Celeste. This won't take long." Celeste pulled out the chair and sat across from him. She said nothing. She only looked at the stack of papers. Preston finally put his phone down, but not because he respected her. He did it because he wanted to see her face when she read the conditions. "The terms are very simple," Preston said, leaning back. "You signed the confidentiality agreement. You're not allowed to mention Meridian Corp in any form, publicly or privately. You're not allowed to mention Naomi Cross. You're not allowed to contact any employee, partner, or investor of the company. In return, you receive a monthly allowance for 3 years and a place to live in the suburbs. I think that's more generous than what you deserve." Celeste opened the stack of papers and skimmed through each page. Her eyes stopped at the section labeled Intellectual Property Rights. Every product, line of code, algorithm, and technical document was listed as the exclusive property of Meridian Corp. Her name didn't appear anywhere. "What about the code I wrote?" Celeste asked, her voice calm, but every word placed with clear precision. "What code?" Preston raised an eyebrow, his mouth curving into a thin smile. "Celeste, you were a technical assistant. Everything you did while working at Meridian belongs to the company. That's a standard employment contract. You signed it on your first day." "I wasn't a technical assistant. I wrote the entire foundation architecture of the trading system, from the first line to the last." Preston stood up, slipped his phone into the pocket of his suit jacket, and walked toward the glass wall. He looked down at the city like a man admiring something he owned. "You want to play this game?" he said, his voice dropping half a tone. "Fine. If you don't sign, I'll have my legal team reopen the entire transaction history you helped build. Do you know what that system was used for? Do you know which channels that money passed through? Maybe you don't, but the court won't care whether you knew or not. They'll only care whether you helped build it. And the answer is yes." Celeste understood. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a threat. If she claimed ownership of the code, Preston would drag her into a legal whirlpool she didn't have the money to escape. He would turn her from the creator into an accomplice. And with his top-tier team of lawyers, she wouldn't stand a chance. But Celeste wasn't the kind of person who walked into a battle without preparing a way out. The night before, while Preston was still at the office with Naomi, Celeste had sat in front of the computer in her old bedroom for the last time. She opened the folder containing the original version of the code she had saved from the year 2019, the version she had kept out of a programmer's habit, always making a backup before deployment. She compressed the entire folder, encrypted it with a private key, then uploaded it to a cloud storage account under a false name. The timestamp on the file couldn't be changed by anyone. It was proof that she had written this code before Preston ever registered the patent. She didn't know when she would use it. Maybe never. But the survival instinct of someone who had grown used to starting from zero had taught her one thing: Don't ever let anyone erase every trace of you without keeping a copy. Celeste closed the stack of papers. She picked up the pen, turned to the final page, and signed. Her hand didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. Preston watched her sign, and the smile on his mouth widened, comfortable and triumphant. He thought this was the moment she collapsed. Celeste set the pen down and pushed the stack of papers back toward Preston. She stood, slung her backpack over her shoulder, the only luggage she had brought with her, then walked toward the elevator. Her finger pressed the call button. The elevator doors opened. Celeste stepped inside and looked back at Preston only once. He was standing in the middle of the spacious room, holding the divorce papers in his hand, looking like a man who had just won a chess game without knowing his opponent had hidden the queen. "Keep everything, Preston," Celeste said, her voice soft, but every word sank down like a nail. "But you should remember, the most valuable thing in this building was never in your bank account." The elevator doors closed. Preston stood still for a moment, frowning, trying to decode that sentence. Then he shook his head, gave a mocking laugh, and went back to the sofa to scroll through his phone. He didn't understand. He wouldn't understand until it was too late. Celeste stepped out of the building into the Chicago evening. The wind from Lake Michigan blew straight into her face, cold and sharp. She raised her hand and hailed a yellow taxi, tossed her backpack into the back seat, and gave the address of the bus station. She didn't look back at the glass tower behind her, not because she was strong, but because there was nothing left there that belonged to her anymore. 4 months later, Celeste Morrow was living in a rented room on the outskirts of Detroit, where the ceiling was so low that she had to lower her head whenever she stood near the corner of the room, and the wall opposite the bed was always damp, with a thin layer of moisture whenever the season began to change. She worked the night shift as a cashier at a convenience store, a 20-minute walk from her room, earning $7 an hour, with a shift that ran from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. Every night, she stood behind the counter, scanned items, counted loose change, and watched the clock move so slowly, it felt as though even time itself was tired. Her bank account had less than $300 in it now, and every week, that number was bitten down a little more by rent, food, and bus fare. One afternoon before her shift, Celeste sat on the bed and opened her old laptop, the only thing from her former life she had managed to bring with her. She typed her name into the search bar. The results came back like a sentence handed down by a court. A string of articles appeared, all revolving around the same story, identical down to the details, clearly written from a single source. Disgruntled former employee leaves Meridian Corp ahead of IPO. Internal source reveals the woman had shown signs of mental instability. Celeste knew who was behind this campaign. Naomi Cross, Meridian's communications director, the woman who had replaced her in every possible sense, had built a wall of articles so thick that anyone who Googled the name Celeste Morrow would see only one image: a troublemaker, a woman who couldn't be trusted. She closed the laptop and lay back, staring at the ceiling. Over the past 3 months, she had sent out more than 30 job applications. All of them were in the technology field, from software engineer to system administrator, even technical content editor. Not one place called back. A resume with a 7-year blank space marked homemaker, combined with a first page on Google filled with scandal, was enough to make every door slam shut in front of her. She had received exactly one response email, from a small company in the suburbs. They wrote politely, but the meaning was very clear. "After careful review, we've decided not to move forward with this candidate." Celeste knew what careful review meant. It meant they had Googled her. There were nights, after she had stocked the shelves and wiped down the cashier counter, when Celeste almost believed Preston had been right. Maybe she really had no value left. Maybe she had only been a small part in the machine he had thrown away once he no longer needed it. But then, every night after her shift, before returning to her rented room, Celeste turned into the public library on Gratiot. The library opened at 6 o'clock in the morning. Celeste was the first person to walk in, backpack on her shoulder, eyes red from lack of sleep, but her steps still carrying purpose. She sat down at the free computer in the far corner of the reading room, opened a blank text file, and began to write. Not a cover letter, not an email begging for help. She wrote code. Line by line, from memory, Celeste typed out the foundation architecture she had built for Meridian. She remembered every function, every variable, every loop of logic she had designed during those sleepless nights 5 years earlier, when Preston had still sat at the desk beside her and called her a genius. She wasn't doing this to sue anyone. She had no money to hire a lawyer, no connections in the legal world, nothing except her mind and 10 fingers on a keyboard. She was doing it for a reason much simpler than that. She refused to be erased. Preston could remove her name from the patent. He could remove her name from the company's history. He could turn her into a name no one wanted to mention on the internet. But he couldn't take away what still lived inside her head. The thing she had created out of nothing. Every morning, after about 2 hours of typing, Celeste saved the file onto a cheap USB drive she had bought at a dollar store. She named the file Draft. But it wasn't a draft. It was proof that she still existed, that the work of her life hadn't disappeared just because one man had decided it should. She slipped the USB drive into the pocket of her coat, stepped out of the library into the pale light of a Detroit morning, and walked back to her rented room to sleep for a few hours before the next night shift began. Life kept repeating itself that way, night after night. But that repetition wasn't surrender. It was a woman keeping a flame alive in the wind, waiting for the right moment to breathe it into a blaze. That night was an ordinary shift, like every other night. The convenience store was empty. The fluorescent light on the ceiling flickered in the corner near the storage room, and the refrigerator hummed steadily, like the breathing of something asleep. Celeste stood behind the counter, checking the money in the drawer, counting each $1 bill and $5 bill just to keep her hands busy. The clock on the wall showed nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The door chime rang. Celeste looked up. A man stepped inside. He didn't look like any customer she had ever seen in this store. He was somewhere in his early 50s. His posture straight as a measuring rod, his shoulders broad, every footstep even and firm. Before he looked at Celeste, his eyes swept across the entire store, from left to right, from the front door to the back door, as if he were assessing the terrain. Former military, Celeste thought immediately. The way this man moved wasn't civilian. The man walked to the counter without buying anything, without asking anything. He placed a white envelope on the glass surface of the register counter, right in front of Celeste. "Someone wants to meet you," he said, his voice low and brief, like he was delivering an order. "It's not Preston Hale. If you want to know who stole your work and why, open the envelope." Celeste hadn't even had time to react before the man turned his back, walked out the door, the bell rang again, and then everything went silent. Through the glass door, she saw him get into a black SUV parked close to the curb. The vehicle rolled away without a sound and disappeared into the darkness. Celeste looked at the envelope on the counter, white, with no name, no address. She stood still for nearly 1 minute, her hand resting on the counter without touching it. Then, she picked it up, tore open the edge, and pulled out a thin stack of papers. The first page was a printed patent registration from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Product name: Meridian Corp Architecture, Financial Trading System. Author and owner: Preston Hale. Registration date: October of 2020. Celeste turned to the second page. Her heart stopped for a beat. It was code, a printed copy of code she recognized from the very first line, because she had written it. Every function, every data structure, every note she had typed at 3 o'clock in the morning in the bedroom in Chicago, while Preston was sound asleep. All of it was here, stamped with a patent, under the name of a man who had never been able to write one complete loop. The final page had only one line: a phone number. No name, no explanation. Celeste folded the papers back together, put them into the envelope, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She didn't call that number that night. She didn't call the next day either, or the day after that. For 3 days, the envelope lay on the small table in her rented room, right beside the USB drive containing the file named Draft that she had written at the library. Celeste looked at it every time she came home from work, every time she woke up, every time she couldn't sleep. But she didn't touch the phone, not because she didn't want to know who was behind that envelope, but because she had once trusted a powerful man. She had once placed her entire life in the hands of a man who said she mattered. And then that man threw her away when he no longer needed her. She wasn't in a hurry to leap into the arms of the next powerful man just because he brought her exactly what she wanted to hear. On the third night, after finishing her shift and walking home through the drizzle, Celeste sat on the bed and opened the envelope once more. She placed the printed code beside the USB drive, opened her laptop, and opened the file named Draft that she had been rewriting from memory for months. She compared them, line by line, variable by variable, structure by structure. They matched. The code in the envelope and the code in the USB drive were one and the same. The proof that she was the author lay right in front of her, in her own hands, written by those same hands. But proof without a weapon was only scrap paper. She had no money to hire a lawyer. She had no connections. She had nothing but the truth, and the truth didn't know how to speak for itself. Celeste picked up the phone. She dialed the number in the envelope. 2 rings. A deep male voice answered. The same voice as the man from the convenience store that night. Celeste spoke briefly, without explaining, without asking anything more. "I want to meet." Briggs picked Celeste up in the black SUV at the corner 2 blocks from the convenience store, at exactly 11 o'clock the following night. He said nothing when she opened the door and climbed in, only gave a slight nod, then drove away. The vehicle moved through the dark industrial streets of Detroit, past abandoned warehouses and stacked container yards, heading toward the harbor. 20 minutes later, it stopped in front of a seafood restaurant sitting close to the water's edge, the kind of place that was probably crowded during the day, but at this hour, all the signs were turned off, and the door was half shuttered. Celeste stepped out of the vehicle and saw 2 other black SUVs already parked there, lined up neatly as if waiting for an order. 4 men stood spread out at the 4 corners, 2 near the front door, 2 at opposite ends of the parking lot. No one said anything. No one looked directly at her. But Celeste knew every pair of eyes was following each step she took from the vehicle to the door. Briggs led her inside. The restaurant was dark. The tables and chairs had all been stacked neatly into the corners, and only one table remained in the center of the room, lit beneath a single pool of light, like a stage built for only one performance. And the man sitting at that table was Barrett Kane. Celeste realized at once that this man wasn't like anyone she had ever met. He was younger than she had imagined, around 33 or 34, but that youth did nothing to lessen the weight radiating from the way he sat. A charcoal gray 3-piece suit, tailored so precisely it followed every line of his body, Oxford shoes polished until they reflected the light, and a white linen handkerchief folded into a perfect square rising from the breast pocket of his jacket. Gray eyes, cold and unreadable, watched Celeste approach without blinking. He didn't stand. He didn't offer his hand. He only lifted his left hand slightly toward the chair across from him, as if her arrival here was something he had known long ago and didn't need to pretend to be surprised by. Celeste pulled out the chair and sat down. The 2 of them looked at each other across the table. Neither spoke first. Celeste didn't speak because she was assessing him. Barrett didn't speak because he was used to letting silence do the opening work. Finally, Barrett spoke, his voice low, his rhythm slow, every word placed down, as though it had been weighed before leaving his mouth. "Do you know who I am yet?" "I know you're not the police," Celeste answered, "and I know you're not a philanthropist." The corner of Barrett's mouth shifted slightly, not enough to be called a smile, but enough for Celeste to know she had just been right. He paused, as if the list was longer, but the rest of it wasn't meant for someone he had just met. "Preston Hale is running a trading system through channels that fall within my business territory. He did it without asking, without informing me, without permission." Barrett's voice didn't grow louder, but Celeste could feel the weight behind each word. This wasn't about money. This was about territory. And in Barrett Kane's world, trespassing on territory was something no one was allowed to do twice. In the middle of speaking, Barrett's phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen, picked it up, said exactly 3 words in a voice as calm as if he were reading the time, then hung up. The entire call lasted no more than 4 seconds. He set the phone down and continued looking at Celeste as though nothing had happened. Briggs was standing behind Celeste, but she heard him speak softly, almost in a whisper, just loud enough for her to catch it. "Savannah Port deal. 40 million. Celeste looked at Barrett. This man had just decided a $40 million transaction in 3 seconds, in the middle of a closed restaurant in Detroit, then returned to his conversation with her without changing the rhythm of his breathing. She understood at once that Barrett Kane operated on a level entirely different from anyone she had ever met, including Preston. "So what do you want from me?" Celeste asked directly. Barrett tilted his head slightly. "You built that system. You understand it from the inside out. I need you to help me remove it from my territory. And to do that, you need to prove before the law that the system belongs to you, not Preston." "You didn't come here because of me," Celeste said, looking straight into Barrett's gray eyes without blinking. "You came because Preston violated something of yours. I'm only the means for you to solve your problem." Barrett stopped. He looked at Celeste for a long while, with the gaze of a man used to reading everyone in a room. Only this time, he had met someone who was reading him back. "You're smarter than your ex-husband thought," Barrett said slowly. Celeste didn't hesitate. "That's exactly why he had to get rid of me." Silence. Behind her, Briggs shifted his weight slightly, the only sign that he, too, was surprised. Barrett placed both hands on the table, his fingers interlaced. "I have the best legal team on the East Coast. I have forensic evidence that my technical team collected from the Meridian system. I have the ability to protect you from anything Preston throws at you. In return, you help me remove Preston from the financial system currently running through my territory. An alliance, not charity, not a favor." Celeste was silent for 10 seconds, the longest 10 seconds in the empty restaurant. She thought of the damp, mold-stained, rented room. She thought of the $300 in her account. She thought of the 30 rejected job applications. She thought of the printed code in the envelope and the draft file on the USB drive. Then she thought of Preston, sitting in his penthouse in Chicago, smiling with Naomi, counting down the days to the IPO, thinking she had disappeared. "I agree," Celeste said. Barrett gave a slight nod, as if that answer had already been expected. But Celeste wasn't finished. "On one condition," she continued, her voice no louder, but clearer. "I use my way, the law and the truth, not your way. If you want me in this alliance, then these are my rules." Barrett looked at her. For a long while he said nothing. He only looked, as if weighing who the woman sitting in front of him truly was. Then he nodded a second time, this time slower, heavier, as if that nod wasn't only agreement, but recognition. Briggs drove Celeste out of Detroit that very night. They drove through the night, through Ohio, through Pennsylvania, heading east. Celeste didn't ask where they were going. She sat in the back seat, watching the streaks of highway lights sweep across the car window, and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Just as morning began to break, the vehicle turned onto a coastal road in Massachusetts, the kind of road lined on both sides with gray stone fences and ancient oak trees leaning into the sea wind. Then Celeste saw it. The Kane family estate wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Gray granite walls ran along the edge of the cliff, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, so high that Celeste had to tilt her head back when the vehicle stopped in front of the iron gate. Security cameras were mounted on every gatepost, every corner of the wall, every porch roof. 2 men stood guard at the main gate, 2 more stood in the parking area, and Celeste counted at least 3 others patrolling along the wall as the vehicle drove into the courtyard. No one looked at her, but she knew everyone knew she had arrived. Briggs led Celeste through the main hallway and into Barrett's office on the 2nd floor. The room was so minimalist it was almost empty, with only 1 large oak desk, 3 computer monitors lined up side by side, 2 chairs, and nothing on the walls except a map of East Coast seaports pinned with marker points. Barrett was already sitting at the head of the desk, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, no suit jacket, as if he had been awake since before dawn. He signaled for Celeste to sit, then began speaking without circling around the point. "Preston Hale is taking Meridian Corp public in 3 weeks. Valuation, $15 billion. The entire value of the company is based on the trading system you built." Barrett turned one of the 3 monitors toward Celeste. On it was the Meridian system architecture diagram that his technical team had recreated from the outside. "But there's a problem," Barrett continued. "Preston modified your code himself last year to integrate an additional cryptocurrency trading function. He doesn't understand the foundation architecture you designed. He only patched things on top of it without knowing he was breaking the security layer underneath." Barrett pointed to a spot on the diagram. "If the initial public offering happens, and transaction volume spikes on the first day, this vulnerability will surface. The system won't just slow down or crash. It'll expose the financial data of millions of users. This isn't a small bug. This is a disaster waiting to happen." Celeste looked at the diagram. She saw at once where Preston had made the wrong change, exactly where she had built a double encryption layer to protect the sensitive data flow. Preston had torn that layer out without even knowing it existed, like a man tearing down a load-bearing wall because he thought it was only a partition. "What's your plan?" Celeste asked. "Let the initial public offering happen. Let Preston step onto the stage. Then strike with an emergency injunction in court, attached to evidence of the security vulnerability and intellectual property fraud." Celeste shook her head. "That's not enough." Barrett looked at her, waiting. If we only file with outside evidence, Preston will say your technical team hacked the system illegally. His lawyers will turn us from plaintiffs into defendants. We need forensic evidence from inside the system. We need traces proving I'm the original author, not my words, but technical traces inside the code itself. Something Preston can't deny, no matter how many lawyers he hires. Barrett looked at her for a moment, then nodded. You have 12 days. I'll clear a path for you to access the Meridian server. That afternoon, another woman arrived at the estate. Tessa Marlowe, Barrett's personal attorney, flew in from New York by helicopter and landed right on the lawn behind the house. She walked into the office as if she had been there hundreds of times, with no polite greeting, no looking around, only setting her briefcase on the desk and looking straight at Celeste. I'm Tessa. I'll prepare you for court. From now until the day we file, you'll work with me 4 hours every day on legal procedure. I don't care whether you're tired or not. I only care whether you're ready before the judge or not. Celeste nodded. The following days blended into one continuous current of code and law. In the mornings, Celeste worked with the Meridian system on the computer Barrett provided, analyzing each module, tracing every modification Preston had made. In the afternoons, Tessa pulled her into the conference room and simulated the hearing, asking questions like opposing counsel, challenging every answer until Celeste no longer spoke like a victim, but like an expert. One evening, as Celeste walked through the second-floor hallway on her way back to her room, she noticed a man standing at the end of the hall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, older than 35, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest. When Celeste passed him, he looked at her with cold eyes, without nodding, without greeting her, only looking before turning away and stepping into another room. Celeste asked Briggs when she went downstairs. Garrett, Briggs said briefly. Barrett's older brother. He didn't explain further, and the way he didn't explain further told Celeste more than any explanation could have. On the 8th day, close to midnight, Celeste was sitting alone in the office, filtering through thousands of lines of code in the core of the Meridian architecture. Her eyes were tired, the coffee on the desk had gone cold, but she didn't stop. Then she saw it. A hidden comment line, buried deep inside the original encryption module, in the lowest layer of the system, a layer almost no one ever touched during maintenance. 3 initials, the note she had typed at 3 o'clock in the morning in 2019, when she sat fixing an urgent bug for Preston in the bedroom in Chicago. Those 3 letters were her private code, a personal habit when writing code, the kind of marker only she understood. Preston hadn't been able to delete this line because it was embedded in the core architecture. Deleting it would mean destroying the entire encryption layer, and he didn't understand enough to know it existed, much less how to remove it. Celeste looked at the 3 initials on the screen. She sat completely still for a long time. Then, without saying a word, she placed her hands on the keyboard and began to type. She wrote the first technical analysis, the document that would prove before the court that the comment line was her digital signature, something no patent of Preston's could deny. On the 10th day, Celeste needed to go into the town near the estate to buy a few personal things she didn't want to ask anyone else for. Briggs offered to drive her, but Celeste refused. She wanted to drive herself, wanted 15 minutes alone on the road without cameras, without guards, without anyone watching her through a security screen. The Kane estate was safe, but sometimes safety could make a person feel like they couldn't breathe. She took the small car Barrett had allowed her to use and drove along the coastal road toward town. Her laptop was in the backpack on the back seat, containing the entire technical analysis she had written over the past 8 days, including the code architecture map, the security vulnerability analysis, and the document on the hidden comment line. Her entire weapon was inside that computer. On the way back, just as she turned onto the empty stretch of road about 10 minutes from the estate, a black pickup truck suddenly accelerated from behind and forced itself against the side of her car, pushing her toward the shoulder. Celeste hit the brakes. The car slid over the gravel and stopped with half the wheel tilted down into the drainage ditch. Before she could react, 2 men had already stepped out of the pickup truck. One opened the door on her side, while the other went around to the back, opened the rear door, and took the backpack. They didn't hit her. They didn't touch her. The man standing by the driver's door only looked at her with cold eyes and said one sentence. "Next time, we won't just take your things." Then both of them returned to the pickup truck and drove away. The whole thing happened in less than 1 minute. Celeste sat in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the pickup truck disappear around the curve. The backpack was gone. The laptop was gone. 8 days of work. The analysis. The document on the hidden comment line. The map of the security vulnerability. All of it was inside that machine. She drove back to the estate, passed through the gate, and walked straight into the office where Barrett was sitting with Briggs. She didn't circle around it. They took the laptop. On the way back, 2 men, black pickup truck. Everything's gone. Barrett was holding a cup of coffee. He set it down on the desk, slowly and lightly. But Celeste noticed his fingers tightening as he put it down, as if he were holding back a force inside him so it wouldn't burst out. He didn't ask whether she was hurt. He didn't ask whether she had seen the license plate. He turned to Briggs, his voice dropping so low that Celeste almost had to lean in to hear it. But every word was heavy as lead. "Find out who did it. Tonight." Briggs nodded once and walked out of the room. Not one more word. Barrett looked back at Celeste. "Go back to your room and rest. I'll handle it." Celeste didn't sleep that night, and she didn't sleep the next night either. She sat in her room and opened the cheap USB drive she always kept in her coat pocket, the USB drive containing the file named Draft from the Detroit Library. It was still here. Not everything was lost, but the detailed analysis, the legal documents, and the vulnerability map were now in the hands of someone whose identity she didn't know. Exactly 24 hours later, Briggs knocked on Celeste's door and spoke briefly. "Barrett wants to see you. Basement." Celeste had never been down to the basement of the Kane estate. The stone stairs led to a bare concrete hallway, lit by cold white light, with no windows. At the end of the hall was a large, empty room with only one steel table in the middle. On the table, beneath the light, was her laptop. Intact. Celeste looked at Barrett. He stood beside the table, hands in his trouser pockets, his face expressionless. "The machine wasn't opened," Barrett said. "The data's intact. Your encryption password still hasn't been cracked." "And the 2 men?" Celeste asked. Barrett looked at her, his eyes flat and still as water without a ripple. "You don't need to know. It's done. And no one will touch you a second time." Celeste looked at him for a while. She understood that she was standing on the border between 2 worlds. The world of law she had chosen, and Barrett's world, where the question wasn't, was it right? But, is it done? She didn't ask anything more. She stepped to the table, picked up the laptop, and quickly checked the data. Everything was still intact. The analysis, the vulnerability map, the document on the hidden comment line, not a single file was missing. She tucked the laptop against her body and turned toward the stairs. Before stepping onto the first stair, she stopped, but she didn't turn around. Whether the laptop was lost or not isn't as important as you think. The code is in my head. I already rebuilt it once from memory in the Detroit Public Library. If I have to, I'll do it a 3rd time. Then she walked up the stairs and disappeared into the upstairs hallway. A few days after the attack, life inside the Kane estate returned to its old rhythm. Celeste continued working with Tessa every afternoon, rehearsing the court hearing, refining the technical analysis, preparing every argument for the day they filed. By day, she was a precise machine, focused, revealing no cracks at all. But night was different. At night, when the estate fell silent and the sound of the sea rose from the foot of the cliff, Celeste couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind slipping through the window frame, and felt the wall she had built around herself over the past 4 months growing thinner with every sleepless night. One night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, she got up, pulled on another layer, and stepped out onto the 2nd-floor balcony. The sea wind in Massachusetts was colder than she had expected, salty and damp, blowing straight from the ocean into her face. She had meant to stand there alone, but Barrett was already there. He was leaning against the stone railing, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, a glass of liquor in his hand, though he wasn't drinking. No suit jacket, no polished shoes, no linen handkerchief in his breast pocket. For the first time, Celeste saw Barrett Kane without any armor on him. He looked younger and more tired. Celeste was about to turn back inside, but Barrett had already noticed her. "You can't sleep either," he said, not as a question. "I rarely can," Celeste replied, walking to the railing and standing a few steps away from him. The 2 of them were silent for a while, looking out at the Black Sea. There was no moon that night, only the sound of waves striking the rocks below, steady and patient. Barrett was the one who broke the silence. but not with the voice of a mob boss. With another voice, lower, softer, as if he were speaking to himself and Celeste had only happened to hear it. My mother died when I was 24. She was the only person in this world who ever made me afraid. Not because she was strong, but because she was always right. She saw everything I tried to hide, everything I tried to turn into something that sounded better than what it truly was, and she never let me lie to myself. He lifted the glass, but still didn't drink, only turned it lightly in his hand. Before she died, she told me one thing. She said, "Son, you can do anything in this world, but never break someone who has placed their trust in you. That is the one thing you have no right to do." Barrett turned to look at Celeste. "Preston broke you. He took your trust, used it to build everything he has, then threw you out when he was done. I hate that kind of man. Not because of morality, but because my mother taught me to hate it." Celeste didn't answer right away. She looked out at the sea, letting the wind move across her face, letting every word Barrett had just spoken settle inside her. Then she spoke, her voice calm, not trembling, not choked, but every word carrying the weight of someone who had lived with it long enough that she no longer needed to perform it. "I grew up in foster care. No family. No one ever came to claim me. I taught myself everything. I walked through everything by myself." She paused for a beat. "When Preston appeared and said I was everything to him, I believed him. Because I had never been everything to anyone. Not once in my life." She turned to look at Barrett. "The biggest trap isn't money, Barrett. It isn't power. The biggest trap is being needed. When someone gives you the feeling of being needed for the first time in your life, you'll do anything to keep it. Even build a system whose true purpose you don't fully understand." Barrett was silent for a very long time after that. He looked at Celeste, not with the eyes of a mob boss assessing a piece on the board, but with the eyes of someone who had just heard an echo of himself in another person's voice. "You weren't stupid, Celeste," he said, his voice low. "You were lonely. Those are two different things. And men like Preston specialize in hunting lonely people because they know that's something money can't buy, so whoever gives it away for free gets to hold everything." Neither of them said anything more after that. The two of them stood beside each other on the balcony, looking out at the black Atlantic Ocean, listening to the waves strike the rocks. No touch of the hand, no promise, nothing except two people who had been betrayed by the ones closest to them, standing beside each other in the cold night, and for the first time, not feeling as though they were standing alone. While Barrett poured all his attention into Preston Hale and Meridian's initial public offering, someone else inside the Kane estate was quietly waiting for this exact moment. Garrett Kane had seen the opportunity from the night Barrett brought Celeste back to the estate. He saw his younger brother, the man who had led the family for 14 years, distracted for the first time. Barrett was pouring resources, personnel, and focus into one woman and one war that wasn't directly tied to the family's core interests. In Garrett's eyes, this was a mistake, and Barrett's mistake was the door Garrett had been waiting 14 years to open. Garrett contacted Preston Hale through a channel no one in the family knew he had. The first call was brief, probing. The second call was more specific. Garrett let Preston know that Barrett was helping Celeste prepare to attack the initial public offering. Preston needed to know that in order to defend himself. In return, Garrett wanted one thing. He wanted Barrett removed from leadership, and he needed Preston to help create a shock strong enough to make the factions inside the family lose faith in Barrett. Garrett's plan wasn't complicated, but it was subtle because it exploited the very internal system Barrett trusted. Garrett was one of only two people with access to the Kane family's main financial account. The other was Barrett. He moved a large sum of money from the main account into an intermediary account he had already prepared, creating a clear digital trail, the kind of trail any financial oversight agency could detect if they knew where to look. Then, Garrett made sure they knew where to look. He let the transaction pass through a transfer channel that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was monitoring in a separate investigation, one unrelated to the Kane family. The unusual transaction appeared on the federal agency's radar like a red flag among thousands of ordinary transactions, exactly as Garrett had calculated. On the morning of the 11th day, while Celeste was sitting in the office finishing the final analysis, and Barrett was meeting with Tessa about legal strategy, Briggs walked into the room with a face hard as stone. Two federal agents at the gate. They have a subpoena. The room went silent. Barrett set his pen down on the desk, slowly, his eyes fixed on Briggs without blinking. A subpoena for whom? You. Barrett stood, He didn't panic, didn't go pale, didn't rush to call a lawyer. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, buttoned them, took the suit jacket from the back of the chair, put it on, and walked toward the door with the stride of a man heading into a meeting, not a man being summoned by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Celeste followed him into the hallway. Through the glass door, she saw two men in black suits standing in the front courtyard beside an unmarked sedan. They didn't have guns in their hands. They weren't wearing armor. This wasn't a raid. This was an official summons. Polite, proper, procedural. But in nature, it was no different from a trap. Barrett stepped out the front door. The two agents presented the documents. Barrett skimmed them, nodded, then turned back to Briggs, who was standing on the steps. "Call Tessa. Tell her to meet me at the federal office in Boston in 2 hours." Then Barrett turned, and his eyes searched for Celeste. She stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, watching him walk away between the two agents. Barrett said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't smile to reassure her. He only looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, with a look Celeste could read more clearly than any words. "Don't stop." The sedan rolled out through the gate. The Kane estate suddenly felt empty in a way Celeste had never felt before. Barrett was held for 48 hours while the unusual transaction from the family account was investigated. Briggs had his movements restricted, because he was also listed as connected. The security team remained in position, but no one gave orders, no one made decisions, no one coordinated anything. For those 48 hours, the Kane family was like a machine without a driver, and Garrett, the older brother who had remained silent for 14 years, began calling each faction in the family, probing, planting doubt, asking questions no one would normally dare to ask. Is Barrett putting personal interests above the family? Is he risking everything for a woman? Celeste stood alone in Barrett's office, looking at the 3 computer monitors gone dark. The estate was silent except for the sound of the sea rising from the foot of the cliff. She thought of 4 months earlier, the Chicago penthouse. She had walked into the elevator alone, with no one on her side, no one saying, "Stay." Barrett Kane was the first person to look into her eyes and treat her like a human being, not a tool. He wasn't perfect. The world he lived in wasn't a world she wanted to belong to. But he had stood on her side when no one else had. Celeste sat down in Barrett's chair, opened her laptop, and began to work. She didn't run. Tessa Marlowe arrived at the Kane estate 6 hours after Barrett was taken away. She came from New York, not by helicopter this time, but by car through the night, and stepped into the office with a file already open in her hands. Briggs sat at the desk across from Celeste, his posture straight, but his face tense, his eyes red from lack of sleep. His movements had been restricted, but he was still inside the estate, because the Federal Bureau of Investigation didn't yet have enough grounds to hold anyone besides Barrett. Tessa spread the detention file across the table. She read the main points aloud, her voice quick and clipped, as if she were reading a battlefield report. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had found an unusual transaction from the Kane family's internal account. A large sum of money transferred into an intermediary account that wasn't listed in the regular records. That transaction had passed through a money transfer channel already under federal surveillance. The digital trail led straight back to the Kane family's financial management system, and Barrett was the person legally responsible for the entire operation of that system. Someone on the inside deliberately created this transaction, Tessa said, tapping her finger on the printed sheet. The trail is too clear, too easy to find. No one in the Kane family operates for 14 years and leaves behind this kind of trail. This isn't a mistake, it's a trap. Celeste sat still and listened. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't fully understand all the legal language in the file, but she understood systems. She understood logic. And there was one very simple question that no one had asked yet. The transaction was made from inside the internal system, Celeste said, her eyes on the transaction log on the table. That means whoever did this had the highest level of access. It wasn't an outside hack. It was a direct action from an administrator account. She turned to Briggs. Besides Barrett, who else has the authority to move money from the family's main account? Briggs looked at her. Silence held for 3 seconds. Then he answered, his voice dropping as if this answer weighed more than anything he had ever had to say. Only Garrett. The room went completely still. Tessa looked at Briggs, then at Celeste. Celeste didn't need to hear anything more. She knew. From the night she had walked through the second-floor hallway and found Garrett standing at the end of it, watching her with cold eyes. She had sensed that something was wrong, but she hadn't said anything because, back then, it had only been a feeling. Now it was data. "I need to see the internal system access history," Celeste said to Tessa. "The time the transaction was made and the login account. If the transaction was made through Garrett's access, then we have proof." Tessa called Barrett's technical team, who were still working remotely. Within 2 hours, Celeste had the system login record in her hands. The unusual transaction had been made from Garrett Kane's administrator account at 2:43 in the morning, on the exact night Barrett and Celeste had stood talking on the balcony. The timing matched perfectly. When Barrett wasn't in the office, when the whole estate was asleep, Garrett had sat in front of a computer and pressed the button. Celeste held the record, stood up, and went straight to Garrett's private room in the east wing of the estate. She didn't knock. She opened the door and walked in. Garrett was sitting behind his desk, phone in hand, as if he were in the middle of a call. When he saw Celeste, he lowered the phone, his eyes narrowing. "You're not allowed in here," Garrett said. Celeste didn't answer that. She walked to the desk and placed the system login record directly in front of him. Beside it, she placed the record of the unusual transaction. The times matched. The access account matched. Garrett looked down at the 2 sheets of paper. His face didn't change, but the hand holding the phone tightened enough for his knuckles to go white. "You have 2 choices," Celeste said. "1, you contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation again. Withdraw the source, admit that the unusual transaction was carried out by you, and that the evidence you provided was false. Barrett gets released. 2, I give all of this to Tessa Marlowe, and let Barrett's lawyer handle it. In that case, you won't just lose your position in the family, you'll lose everything." Garrett looked up. He looked at Celeste with the eyes of a man who had just been defeated by the very person he had underestimated most. The woman he had looked at coldly in the second-floor hallway, the woman he had thought was only a chess piece Barrett had picked up from Detroit, was standing in his room, placing evidence on his desk, and giving him exactly 30 seconds to decide the rest of his life. Garrett said nothing more. He picked up the phone and made the call. Celeste didn't stay to listen. She turned, walked out, closed the door behind her, and went straight down to the office to tell Tessa to prepare the documents to bring Barrett home. 20 hours later, Barrett Kane walked out of the Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Boston. All temporary allegations were withdrawn due to an unreliable source. Barrett was released. Barrett arrived back at the estate at 4 o'clock in the morning. The black sedan stopped in front of the gate, and Tessa, sitting in the front passenger seat, got out first, said something brief to the gate guard, then walked straight inside. Barrett stepped out afterward, alone. His suit jacket was wrinkled, the collar of his shirt was open, and his hair was no longer combed neatly the way it usually was. He looked like a man who had spent 2 days sitting in a white room without sleep, because that was exactly what had happened. Barrett walked through the iron gate and along the gravel path leading up to the steps before the front door. Then he stopped. Celeste was sitting on the lowest step, her back against the stone pillar, both arms wrapped around her knees. She was wearing the old coat she had brought with her from Detroit, dark circles under her eyes, her hair loose around her face. She didn't stand when Barrett came closer. She only lifted her head and looked at him, and in that look, Barrett saw that she had been sitting there for a very long time, maybe for hours. Barrett didn't ask why she was sitting there. He sat down on the step beside her. The 2 of them sat in silence. The sea wind blew in from the east, cold and damp. Somewhere below the cliff, the waves still struck the rocks in a steady rhythm, as if the ocean didn't know and didn't care about anything happening on shore. After a long while, Barrett spoke. His voice was hoarse and worn, no longer deep and steady the way it usually was, but heavy in a different way. "For 14 years, I built this family. From the day my father was gone, I spent every day keeping everything from collapsing. I knew who the enemies were outside. I knew who was aiming at my territory. I prepared for every war." He stopped, looking down at his hands resting on his knees. "It turns out the enemy was sleeping under the same roof." Celeste said nothing. She waited. Barrett continued, his voice softer now, almost only loud enough for the 2 of them to hear. "Garrett left this morning. I gave him 1 hour to pack his things. He didn't say a word. He just dragged his suitcase through the gate and got into the car. No one in the family watched him go. Silence. Then Celeste asked gently, "Are you okay?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He drew in a long breath, the kind of breath taken by someone pressing something very heavy deep inside, so it wouldn't rise to the surface. Losing an older brother isn't a matter of being okay or not okay, he said. It's a matter of what has to be done. Celeste nodded faintly. She understood that sentence more than anyone, because she had once stood in a similar place. I know what that feels like, she said. Preston used to be the person I trusted most in the world. I placed everything I had in his hands, and when he betrayed me, the most painful thing wasn't losing money or losing a home. It was realizing I had trusted the wrong person, and not knowing whether I would ever dare to trust anyone again. Barrett turned to look at her. In the faint light of the sky shifting from black to gray, he looked at Celeste not with the eyes of a mob boss, not with the eyes of an ally, but with the eyes of someone standing in the same place as she was, with the same wound, and the same question with no answer. You don't owe me, Celeste, Barrett said. You could have left last night when the Federal Bureau of Investigation came. No one kept you here. No one forced you to stay. Why didn't you go? Celeste looked up at the sky. The eastern horizon was beginning to brighten, a thin gray line separating the sea from the heavens. Because for the first time in 7 years, she said, her voice light but not trembling, someone treated me like a human being, not a tool. I don't run from that. Barrett said nothing more. The two of them sat side by side on the cold steps, watching the sky slowly brighten. Then, Barrett's hand, the hand that had once held absolute power over an entire underground empire, the hand that had signed decisions no one dared question, reached over and took Celeste's hand, gently, as if he were afraid that if he held too tightly, she would disappear like everyone who had ever made him believe and then left. Celeste didn't pull her hand away. She didn't grip his hand tighter either. She only let her hand rest in his. And the two of them sat there until the first light of the new day touched the surface of the sea. The next morning, when the light on the front steps had changed into harsh sunlight, Celeste and Tessa sat across from each other in the office, with only one question between them. There were 3 days left before Meridian Corp's initial public offering. 3 days to bring everything before the court, or to let Preston Hale turn $15 billion into reality and have enough money to drag out any lawsuit for years. Tessa looked at the pile of documents on the table. Celeste's technical analysis, the fraudulent patent file, the security vulnerability logs, and the copy of the original code from the cloud account Celeste had backed up in the year 2019. We file today, Tessa said. Emergency injunction in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Grounds, intellectual property fraud, and a security risk affecting millions of users. If the judge agrees to review it, we have a chance. If Preston manages to stall past the initial public offering date, we lose. Celeste nodded. They got into the car at noon. Tessa flew from the Massachusetts estate to Chicago on the first commercial flight with available seats. Celeste went with her, backpack on her shoulder, laptop in her hand, the USB drive in her coat pocket. No private plane, no convoy of SUVs. Barrett offered to provide transportation, but Tessa refused, saying that from now until the court date, everything had to be clean, with no trace connecting the Kane family to any document or image. You walk into that courthouse as Celeste Morrow, software engineer, not as Barrett Kane's ally, Tessa said as the plane took off. That afternoon, Tessa filed the request for an emergency injunction at the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois in Chicago. The filing was more than 200 pages long, including the technical analysis proving Celeste was the original author of the Meridian architecture, the evidence of the hidden comment line Preston couldn't erase, the timestamp record from the cloud backup account in the year 2019, and the detailed security vulnerability report, along with a simulation of the consequences if the system operated under initial public offering day transaction volume. Preston found out within 2 hours, and he reacted faster than even Tessa had expected. That same evening, 2 of the largest law firms in Chicago, both among the most expensive in the United States, filed opposition motions on behalf of Meridian Corp and Preston Hale at the same time. The first motion challenged jurisdiction, arguing that the intellectual property dispute had to be handled in a specialized court, not an ordinary federal court. The second requested 30 additional days to review the technical file, claiming that the content was too complex to evaluate in such a short time. The third motion, the most subtle one, requested that the entire case be transferred to a Delaware state court, where Meridian Corp was incorporated, arguing that Delaware was the proper authority to consider an internal corporate dispute. Every motion had enough legal foundation to make the judge stop and consider it, and every pause meant one more day. One more day meant the initial public offering could be completed before the court had time to rule. Tessa fought every motion. For the next 2 days, she practically lived inside the courthouse, filing responses in the morning, arguing before the judge in the afternoon, and writing supplemental briefs at night. Celeste sat beside her in a cheap hotel room near the court, writing the additional technical analysis Tessa requested, explaining the security vulnerability in language simple enough for a judge without a technology background to understand the level of danger. On the first day, the judge denied the motion to transfer the case to Delaware, but agreed to consider the jurisdiction challenge. Half a day was lost. On the second day, the judge denied the jurisdiction challenge, but ordered both sides to submit additional statements before deciding whether to issue the injunction. Preston's lawyers immediately requested 2 more weeks to prepare. Tessa objected fiercely, pointing out that the initial public offering was happening tomorrow, and that waiting 2 weeks would make the injunction meaningless. On the afternoon of the second day, the night before the initial public offering, Celeste sat in the courthouse hallway, her back against the wall, her laptop open on her lap, waiting for Tessa to come out of the judge's chambers. Every minute that passed felt as heavy as stone pressing against her chest. If the judge gave Preston more time, everything she had built over the past 12 days would turn into scrap paper. Preston would take the company public. The money would pour in, and he would use $15 billion to bury her in legal paperwork until she grew old, without ever seeing a ruling. The door to the judge's chambers opened. Tessa stepped out. Her face was expressionless, as always, but her steps were faster than usual. She walked straight to Celeste, sat down beside her, and spoke in a low voice. Emergency hearing. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. The judge will hear both sides and decide whether to issue the injunction before the market opens. We have exactly 1 night to prepare the final presentation. Celeste closed her eyes for 1 second and breathed. Then she opened them and looked at Tessa. We almost didn't make it. Tessa stood, pulled her briefcase onto her shoulder, and looked down at Celeste with a face as cold as steel, but with eyes that were bright. Almost not making it still means we made it. Come on. We have a lot of work to do before 8 o'clock in the morning. 7:30 in the morning. Chicago. 2 worlds, 6 blocks apart, were preparing to collide. At the stock exchange, Preston Hale stood in front of the mirror in the VIP room, adjusting the collar of his navy suit jacket, checking his white teeth, smoothing his hair back. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a king. Naomi Cross stood beside him, in a red dress, red lipstick, a wide smile, holding a glass of champagne even though the opening hadn't begun yet. Outside the VIP room, the trading floor was already buzzing. The large screen mounted on the wall displayed the Meridian Corp logo, the stock symbol MRD, and an expected opening price of $48 per share. Analysts predicted the price would climb above $80 before noon. The public relations team had positioned cameras at every angle, ready to capture the moment Preston rang the opening bell. Confetti had been loaded into the launch tubes on the ceiling. Everything was perfect. Preston drew in a long breath, took Naomi's hand, and stepped out onto the VIP balcony, overlooking the trading floor. Today is our day, he said. Naomi squeezed his hand. No one can stop it now. 6 blocks away, at the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, Celeste Morrow walked up the gray stone steps. Black suit, hair tied neatly back, no jewelry, no lipstick, nothing except the laptop in her hand and the USB drive in her coat pocket. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to fight. Tessa Marlowe walked beside her, her briefcase clamped tightly under one arm, her face cold and focused. They passed through security and walked down the hallway to courtroom number 7. The courtroom wasn't large, with a low ceiling and artificial light. On the other side of the table, Preston's 3 lawyers were already seated. Black suits, straight ties, laptops open, faces cold. They watched Celeste walk in without changing expression, the kind of look reserved for someone they didn't consider a threat. At the coastal estate in Massachusetts, Barrett Kane sat in his office with 3 monitors open in front of him. One screen showed the CNBC live stream counting down to the opening of the initial public offering. The second screen showed real-time stock prices. The third screen was dark. Barrett picked up the phone and made 2 calls. Neither call lasted more than 15 seconds. On the first call, he said only, "Whitfield, Today isn't a good day to hold Meridian shares. I can't say more. The second call was the same message, with a different name. Then he set the phone down, turned his chair back toward the CNBC screen, and waited. No trail, no evidence, just 2 brief calls to 2 institutional investors with long-standing relationships, enough to plant a small seed of doubt at the most critical moment. 8 o'clock. The hearing began. The judge, a man over 60 with silver hair and an expressionless face, sat behind the high bench and looked down at both sides. Tessa stood to present. Her voice was clear, quick, but precise in every word. She presented 3 main points. First, the Meridian Corp architecture patent had been registered under Preston Hale's name, but the original code belonged to Celeste Morrow, with a backup carrying a timestamp from the year 2019, more than 1 year before the patent registration date. Second, inside Meridian's current code, there was still a hidden comment line bearing Celeste's personal technical signature, something Preston couldn't erase because it was buried in the core architecture. Third, Preston had modified the code himself without understanding the structure, creating a security vulnerability that could expose the financial data of millions of users if the system operated under initial public offering day transaction volume. Preston's lawyer stood immediately to object. The head of the legal team, a salt-and-pepper-haired man in a black 3-button suit, spoke in a deep and confident voice. Your Honor, the plaintiff, Celeste Morrow, is a former employee of Meridian Corp. Under the employment contract she herself signed, any intellectual product created during her period of employment belongs to the company. The backup the plaintiff has presented may be an unauthorized copy of company property, and the so-called security vulnerability is merely the subjective opinion of an individual no longer connected to the company, unverified by any independent organization. Tessa responded. Preston's lawyer responded again. The 2 sides pushed back and forth for nearly 1 hour. The judge listened, occasionally taking notes, revealing no leaning. At the stock exchange, the clock read 9:29. Preston stepped onto the platform, holding the small opening gavel. The cameras turned toward him. The confetti was ready. Preston lifted the gavel, smiled broadly, and brought it down. The bell rang. The trading floor erupted. Confetti rained down from the ceiling. MRD opened at $48 and jumped to $52 within 3 minutes. Preston embraced Naomi and raised his fist toward the sky. We did it. 6 blocks away. Inside courtroom number 7. The judge raised his hand, signaling both sides to be silent. He looked at Tessa, then at Preston's legal team, then at Celeste. The court requires more specific technical evidence, the judge said evenly. The plaintiff claims she can prove authorship and the security vulnerability directly through the system. The court will permit a technical demonstration before making a decision. Tessa turned to look at Celeste. Celeste nodded. She opened her laptop, placed it on the table, and began connecting it to the courtroom's presentation screen. News of the emergency hearing reached the stock exchange within 15 minutes. A CNBC financial reporter broke it first, just 1 line scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Chicago Federal Court is reviewing an emergency injunction against Meridian Corp. On the day of its initial public offering. MRD stock stalled at $62, then began to shake. Investors started asking questions. On the trading floor, the noise changed frequency, from excitement into worried whispers. Preston was standing on the VIP balcony when Naomi handed him the phone, her face going pale. The lawyers called. There's an emergency hearing this morning. Celeste Morrow filed for an injunction. Preston looked at the phone screen, then looked down at the trading floor where the confetti still lay white across the floor. The smile vanished from his face, but Preston Hale wasn't the kind of man who waited to be hit. He hit first. Within 30 minutes, Preston left the stock exchange, got into the car with Naomi and the communications team, and drove straight to the front of the federal courthouse. He didn't go inside. He stopped on the steps before the main entrance, where a crowd of reporters had already gathered after hearing there was a case tied to the biggest initial public offering of the year. Preston stepped up to the microphones, his navy suit still perfectly straight, his face carrying the exact measure of seriousness and pain. The face of a CEO who had been wronged. I'm not here as the CEO of Meridian Corp., Preston began, his voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. I'm here as a former husband who is concerned for the mental health of someone I once loved. He paused and took a breath, as if holding back emotion. Celeste Morrow is a talented woman, but after leaving Meridian, she went through a period of severe psychological instability. I have psychological evaluation records here. Naomi stepped forward and handed Preston a folder. He held it up in front of the cameras. And more troubling, Preston continued, lowering his voice. We have evidence showing that Celeste is being manipulated by an illicit interest group connected to the underground financial world. She isn't acting in the name of justice. She's being used as a tool to sabotage a company that's about to create thousands of jobs. He brought out a second folder, printouts of emails supposedly from Celeste's old account, with content suggesting she had contacted parties outside the law to plan the sabotage of the initial public offering. All of it was fake. The psychological file was fabricated. The emails were forged, but in front of the cameras, under the flash of lights, they looked real. And Preston knew that in an age where news ran faster than truth, all he needed was 30 minutes to poison public opinion. The effect was almost immediate. Social media exploded. The hashtag about the case started trending within 1 hour. One half believed Celeste was a victim demanding justice. The other half believed Preston, calling Celeste a saboteur being controlled by the underground world. Meridian stock fell from $62 to $54. But it didn't collapse completely. Investors were waiting for the court's ruling. No one dared sell off in panic yet, but no one dared buy more either. The market hung suspended between both sides. In the courtroom, Tessa received the news about the press conference by phone. She leaned toward Celeste and spoke softly. Preston just held a press conference outside the courthouse. He accused you of psychological instability and of being manipulated by underground forces. He presented fake records and fake emails. Celeste showed no reaction on her face, but inside, she felt the cold anger she had grown used to over the past 4 months, the kind of anger that didn't burn, but hardened into something stronger. Her phone vibrated. Barrett's number. She stepped into the hallway and answered. Barrett's voice was low and clipped. I know about the press conference. I can handle Preston another way. Much faster than waiting for the court. Celeste understood what another way meant. She didn't need Barrett to explain. No, she said. One word. Final. If I win your way, I'm no different from Preston. I'll win my way. She hung up, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and walked back into the courtroom. Tessa looked at her. Celeste sat down, opened her laptop, and looked straight at the judge. I'm ready to give the technical demonstration, she said. The judge allowed the technical demonstration. A court technician connected Celeste's laptop to the presentation screen on the courtroom wall. The image from her laptop appeared large and clear, every line of text readable from every seat in the room. Reporters from 3 major news agencies had been allowed in to record. CNBC was streaming live. Celeste sat in front of the laptop, her back straight, her eyes on the screen. She didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at Preston's legal team sitting across from her with tense faces. She looked only at the one thing she trusted absolutely, the code. Your Honor, Celeste began, her voice calm and clear. I will prove 3 things. First, I am the original author of the Meridian System architecture. Second, the patent registered under Preston Hale's name is fraudulent. Third, the current system has a serious security vulnerability that threatens the data of millions of users. She opened the first window on the screen. On the left was the current Meridian System architecture that Barrett's technical team had extracted. On the right was the backup from Celeste's cloud account, the original file she had saved in 2019. The timestamp was clearly visible in the upper corner. March 17th, 2019. Preston's patent had been registered in October of 2020, more than a year and a half later. This is the original version I wrote, Celeste said, moving the cursor over each module. And this is the Meridian system currently in operation. The foundation structure is the same, from the first encryption layer to the final transaction processing layer. Variable names, function structures, processing logic, all of it matches, because they are one and the same. She switched to the second window. The screen zoomed in on a section of code buried deep inside the architecture core, the original encryption module that almost no one ever touched during system maintenance. Celeste pointed to a hidden comment line. This is the personal note I wrote at 3 o'clock in the morning on March 18th, 2019, when I was fixing an urgent bug in the encryption module. These 3 initials are my personal code, a habit I've had since college when writing code comments. Mr. Preston Hale couldn't erase this line because it sits inside the architecture core. Erasing it would mean breaking the entire encryption layer, and Mr. Hale didn't have enough technical knowledge to know it existed. The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward, looking at the screen through his reading glasses. Preston's lawyer sat motionless. Celeste moved to the final section. She opened a new window and ran a simulation test on the Meridian system. On the screen, she created a simulated environment with transaction volume equivalent to the opening day of the initial public offering. Millions of buy and sell orders running at the same time. "This is the section Mr. Hale modified himself last year," Celeste said, pointing to a section of code marked in red on the screen. "He added a cryptocurrency trading function, but he didn't understand that the underlying encryption layer, the layer I designed, operates on a dual key mechanism. When he patched code on top without correcting the foundation layer, he created an opening. This opening doesn't appear under normal operating conditions. But when transaction volume exceeds a certain threshold," she pressed the button to run the test. "This is the result." On the screen, the simulated system ran for about 17 seconds before the data table began flashing red. Line after line of financial data, account numbers, transaction codes, and users' personal information began appearing in an output window that should never have been accessible from the outside. "If this system runs under initial public offering day transaction volume," Celeste said, her voice neither rising nor falling, only clear and certain, "the financial data of millions of users will be exposed within 72 hours. This is not a personal opinion. This is a technical simulation result that any independent security expert can verify." The courtroom went utterly still. The judge looked toward Preston's legal team. "Does the defense have any technical rebuttal?" The three lawyers looked at one another. No one stood. They were among the top lawyers in the United States. They knew how to challenge every legal argument, but they weren't programmers, and the only person who understood the Meridian system from the inside out was sitting on the plaintiff's side, because she was the person who had created it. The judge struck the gavel. "The court issues a temporary restraining order against all trading of Meridian Corp stock until an official investigation has reached its conclusion. The court will also refer the file to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission for review. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will be notified of the allegations involving intellectual property fraud." At the stock exchange, 6 blocks east, the electronic board froze. The MRD ticker stopped at $51. The graph line, which had been shooting upward like a rocket, flattened into a dead straight line. A floor employee shouted, "Trading halted! MRD has been frozen!" Preston stood on the VIP balcony, his hands gripping the railing. Confetti was still clinging to the shoulder of his suit jacket. He looked up at the CNBC screen hanging on the wall of the trading floor. The camera cut back to the courtroom, and on the screen, Preston saw Celeste. She wasn't looking at the camera. She wasn't declaring victory. She wasn't smiling. She was looking at the laptop screen, at the code, at the work of her life that he had stolen. And in that moment, Preston understood that she hadn't come here because of him. She had come because of the thing whose value he had never understood. At the Massachusetts estate, Barrett Kane sat before the screen, watching the CNBC live stream in silence. When the judge struck the gavel, Barrett didn't react. He only sat still, looking at Celeste's image on the screen, watching her close the laptop and rise from her chair. Briggs stood behind him and asked quietly, "Is it over?" Barrett nodded. He reached out to turn off the screen, but stopped for 1 second before pressing the button, looking at Celeste's image one last time. "She doesn't need me," Barrett said, his voice low, both proud and carrying something heavier that he couldn't name. Then he turned off the screen. The office went dark. 2 weeks after the hearing, Preston Hale's empire collapsed piece by piece, like a building whose foundation piles had all been pulled out from underneath it. The United States Securities and Exchange Commission froze all Meridian Corp stock trading indefinitely. Preston's personal assets were frozen by court order while the investigation into intellectual property fraud continued. The board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Preston from the position of chief executive officer in order to protect the company from the wave of investor lawsuits. The two largest law firms in Chicago, the same people who only a few weeks earlier had been fighting for Preston before the judge, each sent termination letters for the reason of not receiving timely payment. No one wanted to stand beside a sinking ship. The penthouse on the 58th floor, where 4 months earlier Preston had sat on the sofa scrolling through his phone and laughing at Celeste as she signed the divorce papers, was now being emptied out. Movers went in and out, carrying furniture away under court order. Preston sat on the only sofa left, his beard grown and rough and uneven, his eyes sunken from sleeplessness, his phone in his hand. But he didn't call anyone because there was no one left to call. The elevator opened. The sound of heels struck the stone floor. Fast, sharp, furious. Naomi Cross walked in, but not the Naomi Preston knew. No red dress, no red lipstick, no wide smile. She wore a long coat, dark glasses, covering half her face even though the sky outside was cloudy, dragging a suitcase behind her, as if she had already packed before she even came. "The cards are locked," Naomi said, not looking at Preston. "All of them. The black card, the platinum card, even the joint account. I can't withdraw a single dollar." Preston looked at her, trying to say something, but Naomi didn't give him the chance. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation summoned me this morning. They wanted to know about the media campaign against Celeste Morrow, who directed it, who wrote the content, who approved the fake psychological file, and the forged emails you presented at the press conference." She stopped, lowered her dark glasses, and looked straight at Preston with cold eyes. "I told them everything, Preston. Everything. Internal emails, messages, meeting records. I handed it all over. In exchange, they won't prosecute me." Preston stood up from the sofa, his legs slightly unsteady. "Naomi, you said we were partners." "I was the partner of a $15 billion company," Naomi answered, her voice neither rising nor falling, but sharp as a blade. "Not the partner of a federal indictment." She turned her back and pulled the suitcase toward the elevator, her heels striking the stone floor and echoing through the empty penthouse. Preston followed a few steps. "Naomi." She didn't turn around. She didn't stop. The elevator doors opened. Naomi stepped inside, pressed the button, and stood staring straight ahead as the doors slowly closed. Preston stood in the middle of the empty room, one hand reaching forward as if he were trying to hold on to something that had slipped out of his grasp long ago. Around him, the bare patches of wall where paintings had once hung left pale rectangles against the paint. The city of Chicago spread wide behind the glass, still bright, still moving, still not caring. 3 days after Naomi stepped into the elevator for the last time, the conference room on the 42nd floor of the law building on Michigan Avenue became the place where everything ended. The conference room was long, the polished wooden table reflecting the gray sky beyond the glass windows. There were no flowers, no water set out in advance, nothing but papers and silence. On one side of the table, Preston Hale sat beside a court-appointed attorney because his old legal team had walked away and he no longer had the money to hire anyone else. Preston had visibly grown thinner, as if his body had shrunk into itself. His beard was rough and uneven, his eyes were sunken, and the suit he wore, probably the finest one he had left, hung loose on his shoulders as though it had been borrowed from someone else. 4 months earlier, this man had sat in the penthouse, scrolling through his phone and checking the Asian markets without bothering to look up at his wife. Now he sat here, staring down at the tabletop, not daring to lift his eyes to anyone. Across the table, Tessa Marlowe sat on the left, her file already open, her pen placed parallel to the edge of the paper. Briggs sat on the right, back straight, face expressionless, both hands resting on the table. And at the head of the table, Celeste Morrow sat opposite Preston. She wore a navy suit, her hair tied neatly back, her spine straight. She looked at Preston not with hatred, and not with pity. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who had walked through all of it, and was now sitting on the other side of the table. Not because of luck, but because she had brought herself here. Tessa spoke, her voice professional and without a single unnecessary emotion. "The agreement is as follows. Mr. Preston Hale publicly acknowledges that the Meridian Corp architecture patent is fraudulent. He acknowledges that the entire system architecture was built by Miss Celeste Morrow. He transfers all intellectual property rights related to the Meridian system to Miss Morrow. In exchange, Miss Morrow won't ask the court to impose the maximum criminal penalty on the fraud charges." Tessa pushed a stack of documents across the table toward Preston. "Sign the final page. Each page has a space for initials in the upper right corner." Preston looked at the papers. His hand rested on the table, but he didn't touch the pen. He swallowed, his voice hoarse and small. "If I admit this, I lose everything. The company, the patent, my reputation. I have nothing left." Briggs spoke for the first time in the meeting, his voice low and calm, as if he were reading a train schedule. "You've already lost everything. The stock is frozen. Your assets are locked. The board fired you. Your old lawyers walked away. The only thing you're negotiating now is where you'll be for the next 10 years. Preston looked at Briggs, then at Tessa, then down at the papers. He still didn't pick up the pen. Celeste spoke. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. Her voice was just enough for the whole room to hear every word clearly, and every word landed exactly where it belonged. "I'll take control of Meridian," she said. "I'll fix the security vulnerability you created when you altered my code without understanding it. I'll protect the data of millions of users that you almost exposed. And I'll rebuild the company under a new name, one that has nothing to do with you." She stopped, looked at Preston, and a faint smile appeared on her lips, thin as a blade, with no joy in it at all, only the cold precision of someone returning exactly what she had been given. "I'll also give you a monthly allowance," Celeste said, her voice light and even, "for 3 years, and a rented room in the suburbs. Just like what you gave me." The air in the room froze. The court-appointed attorney looked down at the table. Tessa didn't move. Briggs didn't change expression. Preston sat stunned. His eyes widened as he looked at Celeste, and in that moment, he heard every exact word he had said to her 4 months earlier in the penthouse on the 58th floor. A small allowance. 3 years. A rented room in the suburbs. That was what he had thrown to her, like throwing a bone to a dog, with a victorious smile and a threat attached. Now that exact thing had been placed back in front of him. Not one word missing, not one word extra, by the woman he had thought he had erased from his life. Preston lowered his head. He picked up the pen. His hand trembled, the tip touching the paper but unable to write at first. He drew in a breath, then signed. The signature was crooked and unsteady, no longer firm like the signature on the $15 billion patent where he had put his name on someone else's work. Tessa pulled the papers back before the ink had even dried. Preston stood. He looked at Celeste. His mouth opened, as if he wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, to plead, or to shout, but no words came. He stood there for a few seconds, an empty man in a suit too large for him, then turned and walked toward the conference room door. No one watched him go. The door closed behind him, light and clean, like closing the cover of a book no one ever wanted to read again. Celeste returned to the Massachusetts coastal estate one last time. She arrived in the afternoon, when the sunlight slanted through the low clouds and the sea below the cliff had turned a silvery gray. The iron gate was already open. The guard nodded when she walked through, and Celeste realized this was the first time she had entered the Kane estate without feeling as though she were stepping into a world that didn't belong to her. Maybe because she knew this would also be the last time. Barrett was waiting for her in the office on the second floor. No suit jacket, no polished shoes, only a white shirt and afternoon light pouring through the window onto his shoulders. The 3 computer monitors were turned off. The oak desk was empty. No documents, no seaport map, as if he had cleared the office before she arrived. Barrett watched Celeste walk in, and he didn't speak right away. He only stood there, hands in his trouser pockets, looking at her with the kind of gaze Celeste had learned to read over the past few weeks. Not the gaze of a mob boss, not the gaze of an ally, but the gaze of a man looking at something he knew he was about to lose. "You won," Barrett said, his voice quiet. "I know," Celeste answered. "Thank you." Barrett shook his head slightly, as if her thanks were something he didn't need and didn't want. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, took out a small box wrapped in black cloth, and placed it on the tabletop between them. Celeste looked at the box. It was small, fitting in the palm of a hand, with no ribbon, no decoration. She opened the lid. Inside was a USB drive, compact, with a black metal casing. Not the cheap USB drive from the dollar store like the one she had used at the Detroit library. This was a high-security encrypted storage device, the kind Celeste knew existed only in military and intelligence circles. "A full backup of your code," Barrett said. "Encrypted with a key only you have. No one in this world can open it except you." He looked at her. "This time, no one can take it from you again." Celeste picked up the USB drive. It was light, almost weightless, but heavy in another way. This wasn't a diamond ring. It wasn't a check. It wasn't the key to a penthouse. This was protection for the most important thing she owned: her mind, her work, her identity. Barrett Kane, the mob boss who controlled seaports and the underground finance of America's East Coast, had chosen to give her this instead of anything else. and Celeste understood that this was Barrett's way of saying the things he didn't know how to say in words. She slipped the USB drive into the pocket of her coat, the same pocket where she had once kept the cheap USB drive containing the file named Draft from the Detroit library. Then she looked straight at Barrett. "I don't belong in your world, Barrett, and you know that." Barrett didn't object. He didn't try to persuade her. He didn't offer any reason for her to stay. He only nodded, slow and heavy, the nod of a man who had known the answer before the question was ever asked. "I know," he said. Celeste nodded too. Then she added, her voice lighter, softer, as if this sentence wasn't meant for Barrett Kane, the mob boss, but for the man who had stood on the balcony that night, sleeves rolled up, a glass of liquor in his hand, telling her about his mother. "If the world were different, maybe I'd stay." Barrett looked at her, and for the first time since Celeste had met him inside the closed restaurant at the Detroit harbor, Barrett Kane smiled. Not a smile of power, not a calculating smile, but the smile of someone who had just heard the most beautiful and saddest thing at the same time. "If the world were different," Barrett said, "I wouldn't be the man you need to leave." Celeste turned away. She walked out of the office, down the hallway, down the stairs, across the courtyard, and out through the iron gate. There was no convoy of black SUVs waiting, no private plane, no Briggs opening a car door. She stood outside the gate of the Kane estate, on the coastal road in Massachusetts, and called a taxi on her phone. The sea wind blew her hair across her face. She didn't look back. On the second floor, Barrett stood by the office window, looking down. His right hand held a glass of liquor, but he didn't drink. He watched Celeste standing outside the gate, growing smaller in the window frame, until the taxi arrived and she got into the car. Briggs entered the room, stood behind him, and looked over Barrett's shoulder through the window. "You're really letting her go?" Barrett didn't turn around. He watched the taxi roll down the coastal road, growing smaller, smaller, and then disappear beyond the curve. "She's the first person to leave here that I didn't want to stop," Barrett said. Then he lifted the glass of liquor, looked at it for a moment, and set it down on the windowsill without drinking. The taxi took Celeste Morrow back to Chicago. Not back to the penthouse on the 58th floor. Not back to the rented room on the outskirts of Detroit, but to a small office on the 3rd floor of an old building in the West Loop, a place she rented with the first money from a group of investors who believed in her story after the hearing. Celeste founded her own company. She named it Morrow Systems. Not Meridian, not any name connected to Preston Hale or the past. A new name. Hers. On her desk. Inside her company. She sat in front of the computer and began rewriting the payment system from the beginning. This time, every line of code carried her name. Every patent carried her name. Every decision was made by her. She didn't become a billionaire overnight. There was no confetti, no opening bell at the stock exchange, no camera lens capturing a moment of glory. There was only one woman sitting in a small office, typing at a keyboard, rebuilding from the ground up the things she had created once, had stolen from her once, had reclaimed once, and was now building one final time under the name it should have carried from the very beginning. The encrypted USB drive Barrett had given her rested inside her desk drawer, right beside the cheap USB drive from the dollar store in Detroit. 2 USB drives, 2 worlds, 1 journey. Celeste Morrow's story isn't a story about revenge. She could have used Barrett Kane's power to crush Preston Hale without ever stepping into a courtroom. But she chose the harder path, truth and the law. Because real victory is never about taking back money or property. Real victory is taking yourself back. A person's worth doesn't live in what others give you or take away from you. It lives in what you build with your own hands, with the mind no one can steal, even if they take everything else. And when life pushes you down to the bottom, don't let anyone tell you that you're finished. Because sometimes, the strongest foundation is built from the lowest place. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that no one can steal the true value of a human being, please hit like and share this video so that message can travel farther. How do you feel about Celeste's story? Leave a comment below. We always want to hear the feelings that come from deep inside your heart. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories, where justice may arrive late, but it's never absent. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.